Okay, this is Q&A. Yeah.
How does Hishtadlus work, and is the proper attitude for bringing home a paycheck, thank you Hashem for providing for me, or thank you Hashem for enabling me to provide for myself?
How does Hishtadlus work? And when I do something and the result is what I'm working for, do I thank him for giving it to me, or thanking him for giving me the ability to get it for myself? Hishtadlus is a big deal, and it requires several full-hour lectures to get straight on what it is. Rav Dessler has a wonderful essay on bitachon v'hishtadlus, trust and endeavor, and if you really want to understand it, he precedes it with an essay called Neis V'Teva, Miracle in Nature. The two work together, and it's a whole philosophy. I couldn't even usefully summarize that. Now, you ask, what should we be thankful for? Being given the ability to get it for ourselves, or being given the outcome directly? I think the answer is both. Because although we don't cause the occurrence of the outcome, our efforts are related to whether we will get the outcome. Kodesh Baruch Hu observes our efforts and decides whether or not, or I should say, it decides what the outcome should be based on the efforts that we do. So, if I'm trying to make something happen, I can try to move it with my own hands, or I can try to persuade you to move it. When I'm persuading you to move it, I'm also acting so as to get it moved. It doesn't have to be with my muscles. So if I perform the kind of effort that God wants me to perform, and he decides that because I performed that kind of effort, he's going to give it to me, I really have to be thankful for two things. Number one, that he enabled me to perform the kind of effort that he wanted, and also that, as a result, following that effort, he gave me the thing that I was trying to receive. So I think you would have to say thank you for both. Yeah.
So, is God limited by logic? And if not, it's kind of two questions. If not, can he make a necessary truth not necessary?
Okay, is God limited by logic? And if not, then can he make a necessary truth not necessary? These are very important questions. The statements you have in the tradition don't directly address the issue. They sound like they do, seems like they do. People often just jump to the conclusion that they do, but they're wrong. The idea of logical necessity is not found. The concept is not found as a concept. What you do find is statements like this. The Rambam says, and listen carefully, as you know my background, my words are chosen. And if you take what I said and change any syllable, it's going to be wrong. We do not say that God can make a square circle. We do not say that God can make a square circle. That's not the same as God can't make a square circle. They're not the same. The first describes what I don't say. The first is compatible with being quiet all the time and saying nothing. The second is a statement. It's a statement on record that such and such is the case, that he cannot do something. Those are two very different propositions. One is the proposition about my silence, and the proposition about what he cannot do. Now, the way that Maimonides and others put it is a kind of medieval jargon that I don't understand. I certainly can't explain it in modern terms. They say that the impossible has a fixed nature. Those are the words. Teva kavua. Have a fixed nature. And we don't say that God can change the fixed nature of the impossible. We don't say it. What this fixed nature is and why it's invulnerable to God's activity, I don't know. I can't explain what they're saying. But I can explain the outcome in modern terms. So I want to be very clear. I'm not saying what Maimonides said or what he thought. I don't know what he thought. It's not for lack of trying either. But I can give it an understanding, which I think is kosher from the point of view of our sources, and which will answer your question directly. Your question was, is God limited by logic? The answer is certainly not. But he certainly also can't violate logic. He's not limited by it, and he can't violate it. Both. You'll tell me I'm contradicting myself? Well, it certainly sounds that way. I agree. But let me explain what I mean. The laws of logic, according to this conception, are not super strong laws of how the world works. There's just so much power in an electric machine. There's just so much power in a galaxy. Then there's more power, let's say, in this total of energy, mass energy of space-time, and then there are the laws that guide the interactions in space-time. These all have power, and more power. And then at the top of the list there are the laws of logic, which are super powerful. That's a wrong picture. The laws of logic aren't laws of the way the world works at all. The laws of logic don't describe the world. They have nothing to do with the way the world works. The laws of logic are the laws of making sense when you talk. They're laws of using words to make sense rather than using words to make nonsense and say nothing. If there's a failure of logic, it's our failure to make sense when we're talking. It has nothing to do with God. Nothing about God comes up for discussion when you're not making sense. When you're not making sense, nothing's being said. So, for example, if someone were to ask, can God make a square circle? And suppose I compare that with, can God blah? What would you answer if someone said to you, can God blah? Wouldn't you say, I don't know what you mean. What's blah? I mean, it's not an English word as far as I know. I don't understand you. You're religious, right? You've got to say yes. Not if you haven't asked the question, I don't. If you use sounds that aren't words, then you haven't asked the question. So I have to say yes. Yes to what? Can God blah? According to this conception, square circle is just as bad in the end, though the circuitous root, just as bad in the end as blah. I'll give you an illustration. You're on your way to the mall, and a friend calls you up. You're in the mall. Yes. Listen, I need something. Could you help me out? Have you got a spare $25? You say, yes, I have. Please get me a square circle. What would you do? Where would you look? In a hobby store? Or in the bank? Or wouldn't you say, I'm sorry, I don't get you. I mean, get you a what? A square circle? I hope you could explain yourself more clearly, because if you say square circle, nothing lights up under my cranium, it's all dark in there. Square circle? I don't know what to do or where to go. Either explain yourself in other terms, or I'll simply have to beg off because I don't understand what you're talking about. So when we say, as I said at the beginning, we don't say God can make a square circle, the reason we don't say that is because we try as best we can not to say things that are nonsense. We don't waste our time saying nonsense. We don't say it because God can't do it. There's no it. There's no it. When you say square circle, you haven't described an it to be questioned as to whether it can be done or not. There's no it there. It's just nonsense, like blah. I'll give you another example, which is slightly different in tone, but it makes the same point. If you don't understand the second example, then rely on what I said up until now. I want to read Fred. Fred is a portrait painter. He is a universal portrait painter. He can paint any person, old, young, male, or female, healthy or ill, of any ethnic group, in any mood. He's the universal portrait painter. And my friend, the skeptic, says, I don't believe you. I think I know a portrait that he can't make. I said, really? Which one is that? And he says, he can't make a portrait of Santa Claus, can he? Listen, I don't want to break your heart, but there is no Santa Claus. A portrait painter paints pictures of real people. That's what a portrait is. The portrait is a picture of a real person, right? So to say he can't make a portrait of Santa Claus, like saying he can't make a square circle or a blah. Portrait of Santa Claus, by its very nature, is not a description of anything. So it's not a limitation on his portrait-making ability that we will not say he cannot make a portrait of Santa Claus. Or that he can make a portrait of Santa Claus. We won't talk about either of those because there's nothing there to be painted. So the same thing's true with asking whether God can make a square circle. It's a non-starter. It's a non-starter because when you ask the question about square circle, you haven't asked the question. You've just failed to make sense. Now, this also, if understood correctly, answers the famous old chestnut, can God make a stone too heavy for him to lift? The same, by the way, I have this all written up. It's on my website. It's called Omnipotence and Evil Part 1. Let's think. The critic asks, can God make a stone too heavy for him to lift? Now, what's going on in the critic's mind is this. Let's see, Rabbi, what are you going to answer? Yes or no? Watch how I catch you, whatever you answer. If you say he can make it, then by definition he can't lift it. So there's something he can't do. And if you say he can't make it, then that's what he can't do. He can't make it. Either way, there's something he can't do. Now you, Rabbi, you're so frum. I'll bet you believe God can do anything. I'll bet you believe that God is all-powerful, which aren't the same. And you're trapped because you see that God can't do everything. There's at least something that he can't do. Either he can't make the stone or he can't lift it. That's what's going on in the critic's mind. Shall I call it a mind? I'll be charitable. I'll call it a mind. But what we say back to the critic is this. You have what you think is a trap for my yes answer or my no answer. Suppose I tell you, you have failed to ask a question, and therefore neither a yes answer nor a no answer is appropriate. Yes and no are answers to questions, and you have failed to ask a question. And the critic will respond, why have I failed to ask a question? Sound like a question to me. And the answer is this. You want to know whether God can make a stone too heavy for him to lift. Let's see what that means. That stone too heavy for God, who's all-powerful, to lift. That means stone so heavy that God, who could lift anything, can't lift it. Which means stone so heavy that God, who can lift it, can't lift it. And that's a contradiction. So, since your words in which you are putting the question are contradictory words, you have failed to ask a question. And since you have failed to ask a question, you don't deserve either a yes or yes or no answer. The response that I get to you is, have a cup of tea. Then leave me alone. Now, the standard objection to this, which leaps to most people's minds instantaneously, is, Rabbi, I thought you were trained in logic. There's a sin in logic called begging the question. That sin occurs when you're discussing a certain subject and trying to arrive at a certain conclusion, and then along the way you say, let's assume P. Okay, let's assume P. And there's the answer. And you look back and you say, hey, wait a minute. P was the answer itself. And you assumed it? You just stuck it in free? We didn't have to prove it or just demonstrate it in any way? That's called begging the question. You can't just assume the answer. We're discussing whether God is omnipowerful, omnipotent. Whether he's omnipotent or not. And you stuck in, when you demonstrated that my question was incoherent, you stuck in that God is omnipotent. You can't prove that God is omnipotent by assuming that God is omnipotent. That's called begging the question. Well, if I made that mistake, it'd be time to retire. I was a professor of logic for 10 years. So if I made that mistake, I'd really be a terrible sin. But that's not what's going on at all. That's a misunderstanding of the dialectic. Let's go back to the beginning and understand where the critic is coming from. The critic says, you believe in God. You believe God is omnipotent. I have a trap for you. My trap is to show you that you have to admit that there's something God can't do. You believe he's omnipotent. I'll show you. With your belief, I'll trap you so that you have to admit there's something he can't do. He's claiming that I can't defend my belief. I can't resist his attack on my belief. So this dialectic starts as follows. The religious person believes God is omnipotent. He says, watch how I trap you with your belief. Okay, so let's do it. I believe he's omnipotent. Show me how you're going to trap me. Well, You believe he's omnipotent. Can he create this rock or can't he create this rock? Neither way is something he can't do. I say, watch how I defend my belief that he's omnipotent. So I'm allowed to use it. He's claiming he can trap me and defeat my belief. I'm showing him how I can defend my belief. So say, if my belief is correct, then your question is not a question. It's incoherent because you contradicted yourself in stating the question. And thereby, since I can start with my belief in omnipotence, you're not trapping me because the trap that you have laid is an incoherent trap given my belief. So my belief escapes your critique. It escapes your defeat. So there's nothing wrong. I'm not assuming that I'm right. The subject under discussion is not whether or not God is omnipotent. The subject under discussion is whether the critic has a trap that can trap me in a contradiction in my belief. That's the subject under discussion. What I'm showing is that he cannot do that. So there's no failure there. Yeah.
So what would you answer if someone asked you, can God learn something new? Would the answer be, God answers the question?
That's different. That's different. I usually start with that, but I came at it from the other end today. That's different because learn something new is perfectly coherent.
No, but surely you're saying, can God who knows everything not know something?
So what? There are lots of reasons why things go wrong. They don't have to be the same reason. They don't have to always go wrong because the words you're using are incoherent. There are other reasons why things go wrong. There's cases where you say that A can't do B, and B is perfectly coherent, but the nature of B is to be incompatible with A. For example, can a physical object be in two entirely distinct places at one time? The answer is no, because physical objects can't do that. Right? It's not because being in two different places is an impossibility. It's an impossibility for a physical object. Right? So here, God is one of the qualities of God that we associate with God by definition is perfection. And one of the implications of perfection is that you already know everything, and therefore you can't learn something new because it's incompatible with your perfection. But here, the thing to be done is incompatible with God's nature. It's not internally incoherent. Every one of us can do it. So there's no contradiction in the description of the thing to be done. I'm talking about whether there's a contradiction in the description of the thing to be done.
So it's not nature to say that God can't do certain things, if that's one of the things that we're talking about then.
But now, again, it's an interesting tendency. There's a kind of absolutist tendency. It's going on for like 20 years. It's either all this way or it's all that way. It's either completely good or completely bad. Sometimes we deny assertion. Sometimes we talk about what we're not saying. And sometimes we positively talk about what's not true. Sometimes we do one, sometimes we do the other. We're not limited to do it only one way. When the description of what's to be done is a contradictory description, then what we say is we are not going to say that he can, which leaves it open to us to say also we're not going to say that he can't.
Not for that, I meant for his...
I don't mind, but I'm just pointing out that in his case, I'm putting what's called large scope and small scope for the knot. You should know about that, right? In the case where the description of the thing to be done is coherent, then the knot goes inside. And I'm positively asserting that he can't do that. And I have a reason for it. When the description of the thing to be done is incoherent, then the knot goes outside, and it says we do not say he can, we do not say that he cannot, because the thing that's the string of words is a nonsensical string of words, so we don't say either of them. So that's what it is, small scope and large scope. Okay, yeah.
So this kind of goes on a shirm that we went over last week, as far as Rebecca being able to conceive children because of her husband Yitzhak. So it seems like she's unique among all the matriarchs, where for her it's pretty much she conceives on the merit of Yitzhak as opposed to all the other matriarchs. It seems like it's on their merit, because I was trying to find the sources where it says Hashem remembered them. As opposed to here, it seems to be on the merit of Yitzhak. So is there something unique about her?
Let me think about this. I haven't paid attention to this. You're asking. Let me put in a piece of background. You're quite correct that all the matriarchs were barren. And the Torah goes out of its way to say that Leah, God opened her womb, which means she wasn't naturally capable of having children, because he saw that she was less favored, so he gave her children right away. But otherwise she wouldn't have had children either. And the oral tradition tells us that the patriarchs were also barren. which means that the whole of the development of the nuclear Jewish family is miraculous. Every step of the way it's miraculous, doubly miraculous. That's something to just take into mind to think about. Now you're asking, well, what turned it around and what was the cause? And only in Rivkah's case was it through the merit of her husband. In the other cases, it was their merit, apparently. So let's think about this. What do I know? I mean, the verses don't say anything, except in the case of Rivkah. Just trying to think of what I know of the oral tradition. But, yeah, I'm certainly not competent in midrash and that sort of thing. It was just if I. There is this interchange between Yaakov and Rachel. She says, "Give me children, or I'm going to die." and Yaakov says, "Am I in place of God who's held you back from having children?" I do think I remember that there's something there about you should pray for me. I don't know. But I don't think we could just assume that the others didn't pray. Well, we'd have to have more information on it. You could still ask your question. The verses tell us only about Rivkah, and that's the only case that's written. And there's a difference between something that's written in the verses versus something that's in the oral tradition. Not that it's more valid, not that it's more true, but the fact that the Torah made it part of the written gives it a different significance, a different dimension. So it's a good question. I don't really know a good answer for it. Yeah, ask others. You should get. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, what's the let's say the nature of Modeh Ani? Is it a mitzvah, or is it a praise, or I mean, what's the
Saying Modeh Ani in the morning, you mean?
yeah, which is the first thing we do in the day?
Right. So, you sort of asked two questions, but they're not in the same dimension. You ask, is it a mitzvah or is it praise? They don't stand, that's like saying, is it breakfast or is it a pancake? One's an activity and the other's a thing, and they're not. It could be a mitzvah to say praise, right, or not. Now we have a rule, minhag Yisrael kedinhu, that something which qualifies as a minhag of the Jewish people has the status of legality, but on the lowest possible level. It becomes binding, but in the lowest possible level. Now, what it takes to become a minhag is not a simple thing. A minhag is not just something that lots and lots of people do for a long time, even if they're Jewish and religious people. So, for example, there is a minhag for some communities on Shabbos to eat gefilte fish. Some would eat only gefilte fish. There is no Jewish minhag to eat pickled herring. I don't know if that breaks your hearts, I can't help you. But there's no such thing. Why? Because a minhag is an action or an activity which contributes to some law. It contributes to some value, only it wasn't mandated. It wasn't legislated. But people took it on because it contributes to a particular law. Now, on Shabbos, there's a problem. If you have normal fish that has bones in it, you're not supposed to take the bones out of the fish. That's the way you would eat the fish all week long, wouldn't you? You wouldn't put the fish in your mouth and take the bones out of your mouth. But on Shabbos, you can't do it that way. So there's a problem of forgetting that it's Shabbos and taking the bones out, which could be quite serious. If you grind up the fish, by the way, they grind it up with the bones, so you get all the nutrition. And it's a paste, and you cook it, you've avoided that problem. That's what qualifies it as a minhag. Eating pickled herring doesn't serve any halachic purpose, as far as I know. So therefore, it's not a minhag. So a minhag is a fairly serious thing. There is a minhag to say Modeh Ani. I don't know if every Jewish group says it, but it is a minhag, so I would think of it as a mitzvah, yes. Mitzvah on the level of a minhag. It means not something that you can just discard. And now, is it a praise? Certainly it's a praise. But the mitzvah is to say this praise of God when you wake up in the morning. So to ask, is it a mitzvah or is it praise? It's a funny way to put the question. They're not two items in the same dimension. So you have to, I would say, try to work to refine the question a little bit. 1 second, let me take care of this. Yeah, exactly.
In Shmoneh Esreh in Shalom, we say Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. That seems superfluous. So what's the al kol Yisrael?
In asking, when you say Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, it seems superfluous. Not so. It's not the only place. Over and over again, there is a hierarchy, and the stress has to be that you ask for yourself, you ask for your family, you ask for your local community, you ask for your city, you ask for your larger geographical area, and you ask for the Jewish people. And we have a hierarchy of concern. Aniyecha ircha kodmin. If you're giving out charity, the poor of your city come before the poor of other cities. So it isn't as if we have no hierarchy of concern. You have more concern for the members of your immediate family than you do for your extended family. Then not everyone is treated equally. Therefore, it's very important. If we just put it in the plural, it's ambiguous. The plural doesn't tell you which group we are talking about. And if you say it all should just be for the Jewish people as a whole, that then gives no expression to the fact that those that are closer to you, you have a higher responsibility for them. So I think it's important to say, Aleinu, meaning some kind of smaller group, some kind of smaller, more directly relevant group, and then including also all of the Jewish people.
You don't do that in the other brachos of the Shmoneh Esreh.
I'm not sure that's correct.
That was always the question that when we're davening for the community of Israel. Rachem Aleinu, Barech Aleinu.
I think that the blessings are basically blank plural. So I suppose you're just assuming that the blank plural goes to the whole of the Jewish people all the time.
Yes, that was my
Because sometimes the word Yisrael is mentioned in the blessing, and sometimes it isn't.
But God, you don't say Shalom as well.
What's that? I'm not getting it.
Shalom.
Kaddish.
In Kaddish?
No, at the end.
No, he's not talking about Kaddish.
Shalom.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm saying it occurs elsewhere. I'm just. For example, in Tshuva and Slicha, Yisrael isn't mentioned. But in Geula, Yisrael is mentioned. And in Fuah, it is mentioned. In Parnasa, it's not mentioned. So in Gibutz Golios, it is mentioned. In Hashiva Shoftenu, it's not mentioned. So I don't think that the question is, well, you could ask your question, why is it mentioned here specifically in detail? Let's ask the question that way. But say, no, that's the avodah of the whole of Klal Yisrael. Let's see. Okay, I could give you an answer. The Shmoneh Esreh classically breaks up into three pieces. It starts with praise, and then there's petition, and then there is gratitude, thanksgiving. Sim Shalom at the end is another expression of petition. So it really doesn't fit the three-part structure. So there are those who say that Sim Shalom is a response to Birkas Kohanim. And the idea is that when you are promised something, when it's the principle says the Kodesh Baruch Hu gives something, you have to show that you care about it. You have to show that it's meaningful for you. You don't just take it for granted. You ask for it. You ask for that which you have been promised to receive. And they bring a parallel. We say in the Ser Shemei Tshuva, the first blessing, Kosveinu b'sefer HaChaim l'mancha Elokim Chaim. Write us in the book of life for your sake. Now, have we earned entry into the book of life, or have we not? If we've earned it, then presumably he'll do it because he's just. If you haven't earned it, what are we saying? I know I didn't earn it, but write me in anyway. Do me a favor. Put me in even though it's false. Probably not doing that. So what they say is, yes, he's shofet, and you can trust him. He will be just, but you have to show that you appreciate it. You have to show that it's meaningful to you. So that, of course, I'm only asking if I deserve to be written there. I want you to know that I have that appreciation. Now, in Sim Shalom, you have Shalom, Tova, Uvracha, Chay, V'Chesed, V'Rachmim. 6 things that you ask for. In the priestly blessing, there are 6 verbs. Yorecha, Yishmerecha, Yoher, right? There are 6 verbs, and the 6 things. So they say that the 6 are connected to 6, and you're showing that kind of appreciation. Now, the Kohanim is standing in front of your congregation, and they're blessing your congregation. That's the Aleinu. And then you say, well, I'll call Yisrael. It was a good question. Yeah.
I saw in the Rabbi Moshe Meiselman's book, his name was Moshe Meiselman?
Yeah.
I saw in his book that he wrote that in the name of the Rav of the Bachar Yitzchak, that even if there would be like that, even in the face of seeming contradiction, we'd always side with the rabbis. And my question is, if we're always going to if we're always going to end up siding with the rabbis, is there any point in trying to defend against seeming contradictions from between?
Okay, I don't know which pages you're quoting from, but he has a long discussion there of a tshuva from the Rashba. And the tshuva from the Rashba says the following. Let's suppose you have a statement in the Talmud which says something about the factual world, and you have a report that contradicts what it says in the Talmud. So the Rashba says, number one, who's the report coming from? Coming from non-Jews? It's wrong. 1,000 non-Jews? It's wrong. 1 million non-Jews? It's wrong. 10 million non-Jews? It's wrong. Period. Wrong. Pay no attention. Okay. Now let's say it's coming from a Jew. Which Jew? What kind of credibility does he have? If he's a Jew with the kind of credibility that you can't deny, then step 2 is to go back to the Gemara and see whether the Gemara can tolerate a different understanding. Now, here's a trap into which many modern people who say that they're from fall. That means I reinterpret the Gemara to be consistent with what the observation shows me. That's wrong. Capital W. It's wrong. The rules for interpretation of our texts are internal rules. They're rules about how the texts are constructed, what kind of logic they use, and what the vocabulary means, and the context of the rest of the literature. But you may have overlooked something. So you don't reinterpret it to make it consistent with the observation. You see whether it can be reinterpreted in its own terms. Maybe you missed an interpretation that would be relevant. That's step 2. And if you do that and you find a way of understanding it, then you could say that at least that way of understanding is immune from the objection that's being raised. Then the Rashba says, if you find that the observation is undeniable and that the text can't be reinterpreted, then declare and admit that it's a contradiction and believe that the text is right. Believe that the text is right. Because when the Gemara when it's, I say, as like Rabbi Muslim puts it, it's a warranted statement. Not everything that's said about the natural world in the Talmud is meant to be absolute. Some yes and some no. Particularly the ones that trace back to prophecy are. Ones that are not traced back to prophecy don't have to be. So, but if it's such a statement, then the Rashba says, understand that the Talmud is right, and acknowledge that contradiction. Don't dismiss it. Don't deny it. Don't paper it over. And then just say, we don't know the solution. That's all. But don't use that as a reason to deny what the Talmud says. So either what you're doing is you're betting on the fact that there is another interpretation of the Talmud we haven't thought of, which could possibly be, or that in the end, the observation wasn't reliable, even though it seems to be perfectly reliable. This actually happened with a fish that was brought to the Tosis Yom Tov, which had fins and no scales, which contradicts what Chazal say. And for 200 years, there was scholarly discussion. What is a fin and what is a scale? Must a fin be used for flipping in the water or not? If the scales fall off at a certain point, then it comes out, scales, are they scales, and so on. There was 200 years of literature on it, all of which is true, valid, and valuable. And then the Chassid Sofer went to release the thing in its neighborhood, the habitat, and it turns out to be a reptile, not a fish at all. It's not a fish at all. It's not a fish, just not a fish. For 200 years they thought it was so. And it just turned out not to be right. See? So it's just not correct. So there's always a reason to investigate, there's always a reason to compare, there's always a reason to reconsider how you understand the Gemara, and to be aware that there is a contradiction, and then to look for the time when the contradiction will be resolved. So I wouldn't say we just turn our backs on it. On the other hand, if it's something which the Talmud traces back to prophecy, then it's something which is non-negotiable. There are several cases in the Gemara where critics attacked things that go back to prophecy, and so and so is not supposed to have children, and then let's see, the gestational period of a snake is 7 years, and they said that it became impregnated and gave birth in a year. And who told you it wasn't also pregnant from 7 years before? Did you check that? No. This such and such a thing has to die within a year, and it lasted a year and a half. You watched it day and night, 24 hours? Who told you it wasn't switched with something else? Another one was put in there. You don't know that? So you have to think carefully and creatively, and you have to be very. And if you don't find an answer, so then you say, okay, we don't have an answer. There have been many, many cases where things looked as if they were contradicted, and in the end turned out that it was a mistake. So this could easily be one of those as well.
Do you trust that in the end of the day, it'll be solved?
I'm sorry, I don't get here.
Do we trust that in the end of the day it'll be solved, like these contradictions, and then it won't be a contradiction at the end, or do we say it'll always be a contradiction? And
how could you say it will always be a contradiction? You don't know the future. You don't know which way new understanding will take. How could you do that? Right? You could even discover that there are mistakes in the text, and especially in the Gemara. On every page of Gemara, there are at least 4 commentaries that correct the Girsa in the Gemara. And you could find that there's another Girsa that fits that Girsa. I went through a Gemara, and I was struggling with it, and I couldn't make sense out of it. I looked at the Rashash, where it's written in the Gemara, it says who, which is masculine, it should say he, which is feminine. Oh, wow, it's talking about something else altogether, right? Of course it didn't make sense, right? It took me a long time to get to the Rashash. When I got to the Rashash, I thought, okay, I didn't make a stupid mistake. It's just that the text is an incorrect text. Yeah.
I asked the Rabbi a question a couple of weeks back, and I actually found the Gemara. It says, the Gemara says this about, the Gemara, they asked the Gemara why it says Toiv in one sentence as Dibros, and not in the other.
Tohu?
Toiv.
Tov?
Yeah, that's the word.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And then he said, the Gemara says, I don't know, I didn't even realize it was there. Go ask this other guy. So I was just wondering, based on that, if you see these people, they weren't, I don't know, they weren't thorough knowledgeable about all the psukim, would they?
I don't think you can go from the luchos to the psukim. There are different opinions as to what was on the luchos. Not everybody thinks that the first luchos had the psukim in Shmos, and the second luchos had the psukim in Vayeschanan. Nobody says that. The contrary. There are those like the Ibn Ezra who say that what you have in Vos Chanan is a paraphrase of what you have in Shmos, and the two were identical. So the fact that he didn't know what was on the luchos doesn't mean he didn't know the psukim. They're two separate subjects. Yeah.
How is the national relation at Sinai not like other generational myths, like Homer's account of the Trojan War, which to my understanding would be like, would be gathered consensus throughout the ages and then just collective retellings?
So in my book, I go through this in great detail. How's the but
you go through this example?
I think I have the Trojan War there, yes, and I have I do have the Trojan War there. So what makes the revelation at Sinai and other Jewish miracles different from the myths that you have in other nations is that the revelation at Sinai is a member of a certain class, and the other stories of other nations, which are known to be false, aren't in this class. And by the way, there is archaeological evidence that the Trojan War did take place. So you can't just assume that it's not true. That happens to be something which is discussed. They have found certain things. The dating is uncertain and so forth and so on, but it can't be classified as that the war didn't take place. That the war didn't take place, right? Well, what is it we're talking about, right? The speeches that Achilles made and so forth and so on weren't national experiences. They were private events. Everybody agrees you can make up private events. You're talking about a war. Even with a war, it's a little tricky because, so the category that I'm talking about are what I call national experiential traditions, which means it's a tradition which at some time the whole nation accepted. Whole nation. There are crazy people and there are vicious people and there are, there are flat earthers also. It's a tradition that the whole nation accepts, number one. Number two, it's a tradition that describes an event that took place to the ancestry of those people, not to some other nation. Number three, the event that took place in the story, the event is described as something which the whole of the ancestry at that time witnessed, every man, woman, and child. And it's a story of an event which is the kind of thing that people wouldn't forget. It's the kind of thing that's so important, makes such an impact on their lives, that you would expect the culture and the religion and the literature and the values to be affected by it, and you would expect the cultural memory of it. Unlike, for example, solar eclipses, which every nation saw from time to time, but very rarely were records made of it. Very, very few kept records of it, and because everything continued afterwards as it was before. So even with the Trojan War, now who's going to keep a record? Well, I suppose the people of Troy, they're gone. They didn't leave any trace. They don't have any group that carries their traditions, right? So then it's going to be the Greeks, right? Well, how many of the Greeks experienced the war? The army. Is that 80% of the people? Probably not. The women didn't go. Is it 50% of the people? Well, some of them are too young. So it's 30% of the people? That's not a national experience. That's not a national experience. The experience of a sizable but considerable minority. So my category wouldn't apply to that. So even if it were a myth, it wouldn't be a myth of my type. My claim is that all national experiential traditions everywhere in the world, in all nations, at all times, are true. I can tell you this, there isn't a single one that's known to be false. There isn't a single one that's known to be false. And I think that is very substantial evidence that they're all true. Somebody says, well, just because you didn't find any bad ones, that means they're all good? Well, yeah, because I'll tell you, you know that in the ancient world, myth-making was a very widespread cultural practice. Now, you look at the myths that people believed in. By the way, there's a book called Bullfinch's Mythology. It was 780 pages, and I went through it page by page. And I categorized, I have this in my book, I categorized the types of myths that there are, and what they're about, and who wrote them, and so forth and so on. There are only two which could qualify as myths about national experiences altogether, and in both cases, it's nation A that has a myth about what happened to nation B. In no case do you have, in 780 pages of myths, do you have a single case of a nation having a myth about its own ancestry, having a national experience. Not one. So, if you have this myth-making cultural process, and some are about men and some are about women, and some are about the rich and some are about the poor, some are about the smart and some are about the dumb, and some are about the lucky and some are about the unlucky, and different kinds of animals, and some are at sea and some are on the land and some are in the mountains. There's tremendous variety. Right? Tremendous variety of the types of these. Some are large scale, some are small scale. Right? Just there's one corner, one little corner on the side, national experiential traditions, of which there are none. Isn't that a little suspicious? How come they didn't go there? With all the variety of it, seems like there was no limit in the kinds of stories that they were interested in and used to motivate themselves and to give a basis to their history and so forth and so on. So my explanation is the reason why they didn't go there is because you can't make them up. Other stories you can make up, this you can't make up. And if you ask, all you have is evidence that there are no false ones that have been found. Why is that evidence that the rest of them are true? I'll give you an example. Is it possible to have very good evidence that all A's are B's without finding a single A that's a B, not one example at all? Is it possible to have good evidence that all A's are B's without finding a single A that's a B? Not one example at all. The answer is, yes it is. And I'll show you how. I have a lake. I find roe in my lake. Fish eggs. So I know there are fish in there. Well, I've been looking. I don't see any fish. And yet there's roe in the lake. So I've decided to try to catch some. So I got a boat and I got a net. Now this net has, like every net, it has holes. And the holes are 4-inch squares. And I've trawled the lake, daytime and nighttime, north, south, east, west, around in circles and so on and so on, and I haven't caught a single fish. I now know that all the fish in my lake are smaller than 4 inches. Don't I? Because if they were bigger than 4 inches, I'd have caught them. I didn't catch them. I don't have one, not one fish, but I know that all the fish in my lake are smaller than 4 inches because I had a way of catching the ones that were bigger. So here too, I think we have a way of catching false NETs. If it were possible to have NETs that were established and believed, then the myth-making apparatus, myth-making institutions of the ancient cultures and the modern cultures, just talk to I won't say which political party it is, but okay, right? The myth-making structures are in business, and yet somehow they never step over this line. I think the reason is because if you stepped over the line, nobody would accept it. Nobody would believe it. So I think that if you go through in the book, I have a number, and I answered in detail certain written critiques, and the Aztecs and the flower, the princess, and I've answered them all in detail. I have some of the answers on my blog. And you can see the ones that I've gone through. And this has been a cause célèbre for a long time. Maybe you'll find one that I haven't answered yet. I just give you one example. There's, I don't know what they call it anymore. Indigenous peoples, is that okay? Not Native Americans, because that sounds derogatory. What are the current fashions? Who believe in a national revelation. This person showed me that they believe that their God, whatever it is, spoke to the whole nation. Now, how big was the nation? 500 people? Okay, I'm not going to fight with that battle at the moment. Spoke to the whole nation at once, and they all heard the God speak. So he said, you think that's unique? Here, you have it right here. So I mentioned it to some of my students. One of my students did a little research. He said, actually, the story goes like this. The story says that nation A, all of them heard their God speak, right? And then they all died. All of them, every last one, no survivors. And the priest of nation B told nation B that this is what happened to nation A. Gotcha, okay? That's not my principle. My principle is got to be your ancestors. Your ancestors, not somebody else's ancestors. So when you hear these things and you go do a little research and you check the details, you find that, well, as I say, there have been a lot of potential counterexamples, and somebody wrote a book called The Making of Myths in Modern Times, something like that. Two leftist sociologists. Eight national myths that were created in modern times. Somebody mentioned this book to me and said, here you got 8 counterexamples. National myths in modern times. So I went through it, and in my appendix, I took every case in the book, and I analyzed every case in the book, and not a single one fits my definition. So I'm fairly confident that it's been tested quite thoroughly. But if there's others that I haven't thought of, by all means bring them to my attention, and I'll try to deal with them. Yeah.
Just in addition to that question, some people claim that, for example, that's not the Rav said it's not the only thing. There's also the man also something that can be.
Yes, I say that explicitly, because and the man has a tremendous advantage because most of the events are one-time events, and you can question how settled was a person in his mind, how clear-headed was he, does he remember the details well, and so forth and so on. You could raise that question, but the man happened thousands of times, and became routine. So and the Kuzari, which mentions this principle in his own way, uses the man as a principal example. Now, if you take what I just said, but now you're telling me that it only happened once, and they were perhaps excited and confused and so forth and so on. Okay, that's all true, but it doesn't explain why there aren't other traditions which also could be confused and excited, and there aren't any of those at all. None. Zero. So even with these weaknesses, you don't have any other such stories that we know are false. None. That being the case, doesn't count. The temptation which people find very difficult to resist is to think up a scenario, but it could happen this way. I see how they could become convinced. I see how they could be misled. I see how the story could be mistold, and little things could creep in and so forth and so on. I'm sure that if this kind of procedure took place, it certainly could happen. That's an exercise of your imagination. Congratulations, you have a great imagination. Write a novel, maybe Simon & Schuster will publish it. But we're not talking about the strength of your imagination, we're talking about the real world. There are lots of things that people imagine about the real world that aren't true, and this could be another one. How can you tell? Take a look at the empirical record. Find me a real one. Don't just think up a possible one that's plausible to you. Find me a real one. This is the difference, as I say in the book, between saying that a counterexample is probable or possible. If you think up a scenario and you ask me, but isn't it possible it happened this way? The answer is, yes, of course it's possible. Everything's possible except contradictions. I give possibility right away. But I'm not claiming that I can rule out every possible alternative. I'm claiming I can rule out every plausible or probable alternative. What makes an alternative probable? Well, I think that the thing that you're talking about, the sort of thing you're talking about, should have happened, let's say, in the whole of human history 6 times. Is that asking a lot? That there be 6 real examples of something that you say is within the norm of human psychology and human sociology, it's the kind of thing that you can expect to happen 6 times? You tell me it's never been known to happen, and yet it's probable? I find that very hard to digest. If you haven't got a single known example and you say it's probable, that sounds very hard to digest. If you say it's possible, I give it to you, but it's not relevant. Anyway, all this argumentation is in the book.